Despite it being her day off, Emily Dawson woke up earlier than usual. She was excited for her date at the tourist lodge by the lake. Michael told Emily about the date the day before, so she had time to pack everything she needed to take with her. And although they had scheduled the trip for the evening, Emily still couldn't stop thinking about it. She paced around her room, looking up at the clock from time to time. "Darling, what's with your mood? Is it about a man?" said her guardian and nanny, Mrs. Somers, with a smile. "I can't hide anything from you, Mrs. Somers," Emily answered evasively. She put her arm around the woman's skinny shoulders. Not many people knew that Emily's real parents had died many years ago in a terrible car accident on an icy road. Emily was 7 years old at the time, and the only reason she didn't meet the same demise was because she was suffering from a cold and stayed home with her nanny. Emily's parents were wealthy business people who could afford a nanny since the day their daughter was born. And it just so happened that Mrs. Somers was Emily's nanny at the time of her parents' tragic death. Had it not been for her, Emily would have certainly ended up in an orphanage. Orphanages always take in children who can no longer be supported by their parents. Fortunately, the foster care board agreed to allow Mrs. Somers to be Emily's foster mother, despite the fact that she was just her nanny. Mrs. Somers did her best to raise Emily with the highest moral standards and instill in her a deep respect for her late parents. Emily grew so close to her nanny that without even realizing it, she began to call her mother. Thanks to the money she inherited from her parents, Emily had been well provided for since childhood. Mrs. Somers was innately ambitious and very protective of Emily's interests. She would never allow herself to take even a cent from her stepdaughter's inheritance money. With a helping hand from Mrs. Somers, Emily grew up to be an intelligent and obedient young woman who loved books about adventure more than anything else in the world. When Emily graduated from high school, her foster mother suggested she try her hand at journalism, which, as we know, goes hand in hand with a literary mindset. After enrolling in a university, Emily became the star of her freshman year in the department that produced many talented and diligent journalists. At about the same time, Emily met Michael Thompson, who busked on the street with his guitar for a living. Michael came from a poor family and loved music from an early age. The determined boy learned to play guitar at the age of 10, and that eventually became his purpose in life. At first, Emily was a little cautious and not very trusting of Michael. She soon realized, though, that Michael was the sweetest man in the world and fell deeply in love with him. The young couple spent a lot of time together, wandering the dimly lit night streets and city parks. Michael and Emily fell in love with each other at first sight, and everyone who saw them immediately knew that they were a couple. Unfortunately, Michael wasn't the only person attracted to Emily's beauty. For the longest time, Jared Nelson had been stalking her. He was 3 years older than Emily and made it his life goal to follow her everywhere she went. Jared was the son of wealthy landowners and had everything he needed for decades to come. More than anything else, Jared loved to spend his evenings in nightclubs and restaurants. Everyone would know who he was, from the doorman to the assistant cook. Because of his love for gambling at online casinos and private poker clubs, he never had any cash on hand. For this very reason, Jared was swamped in debt and had to hide from creditors that were tracking his every step. To err on the safe side, Jared went everywhere with his trusty buds, Henry and Peter. Emily didn't like men like Jared and preferred quieter, more predictable ones, like Michael. To top it all off, Jared and Michael didn't get along with each other, thanks to their completely different personalities. Once, they even got into a fight, ending in Michael throwing a fairly drunk Jared into a swimming pool to cool off. That was when Jared started hating Michael, and the day he swore him as his rival. As Emily prepared for a romantic rendezvous, all she could think about was Michael. By the time there were only 2 hours left before the date, the phone rang at the young woman's house. Emily was surprised to hear Michael's mother on the other end of the line. "What happened, Mrs. Thompson?" Emily asked hesitantly. "I don't know how to say this, hon. Michael was attacked yesterday. Some lowlives beat him up in the alleyway, and now he's in the ICU. The doctors are doing everything they can, but it's not looking good," Mrs. Thompson answered between sobs. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. "How could that be? We parted ways last night and everything was okay," she answered in a shaky voice. Mrs. Thompson simply cried in response before ending the call. Emily felt that she had to be with Michael and hurried to the hospital to see him. Unfortunately, despite the doctor's best efforts, her fiance fell into a coma. According to the medical staff, there was no telling when he'd come out of it. It could be a matter of days or even several years. Emily's soul was in disarray. Her whole life was falling apart. 3 months flew by unnoticed. All the while, Emily made sure to visit Michael every day. Unfortunately, nothing the doctors would say gave Emily any hope. It all just sounded like dry facts to her, rather than a plan to help her fiancé. One day, on her way home from the hospital, Emily saw Jared and his pals in an alleyway. They were drinking whiskey right in the open and didn't seem to care who they saw. Emily felt sick to her stomach at the sight of Jared and his company. "Oh, look, it's Emily. Where's your buddy Michael? Doing well in the hospital?" Jared asked with a sneer. "What do you care? It's none of your business anyway," Emily snapped rudely. Jared grinned in response. He took a sip of whiskey before grumbling. "And what if I told you that I'm the one who put him there? Don't you believe me? I never forget when people wrong me. And if you want to go to the police, that's up to you. But I didn't tell you anything, and you'll just sound like a madwoman." Emily turned pale at his words. She couldn't believe that Jared had it in him to attack Michael in an alleyway with his friends. Her first thought was to call the police and bring those lowlives to justice. But then, remembering how well conducted Jared's father was, she realized that without evidence, there would be no justice. Just unnecessary attention from the press. Emily was also afraid that the locals would end up accusing her of slander or consider her crazy. So she said nothing to Jared and hurried home. "I'd rather deal with this myself than stand as a witness in front of a jury," Emily thought to herself, battling her emotions. Jared simply laughed smugly as she left, without a hint of shame or remorse. Of course, what Jared didn't know was that right there and then, a very powerful feeling of anger bubbled within Emily's chest. She couldn't stand the fact that he was virtually untouchable and despised his pretentiousness. "I need to have him punished. If I don't, I'll never be able to live with myself," Emily whispered while a desperate plan hatched in her head. She didn't have any intention of letting Mr. Somers know, of course, as her nanny might have chosen to interfere at the wrong moment. In order to enact revenge while remaining anonymous, Emily bought a black cassock, similar to those worn by nuns. She put the hood on and headed for the men's bar where Jared and his gang liked to hang out. Emily had brought a bottle of expensive whiskey and a miniature pocket recorder, like the ones that journalists use during interviews. Needless to say, a nun visiting a bar in the middle of the evening came as a bit of a shock to the patrons. Emily glanced around, immediately spotted the trio she knew, and walked slowly towards them. "Good evening, young men. How about we split this bottle of fine whiskey?" the nun asked, taking the bottle from her purse. Emily tried her best to put on an accent as she spoke. "Of course, ma'am. Take a seat. We're always happy to make new acquaintances," Jared said and winked at his buddies. The three of them were already quite drunk, which meant that there was no chance they'd recognize Emily by her voice or figure. The nun poured the whiskey into glasses and offered them to the men. Emily didn't have to ask twice. Jared and his boys drank up eagerly the second the glass touched the bar counter. As soon as their glasses had emptied, the nun pulled off the hood from her head and asked, "Recognize me?" "Emily, what are you doing here? What's with the getup?" slurred Jared in surprise. "I'm glad you recognize me, hon. You know that whiskey you just drank? I poisoned it. In a few minutes, you'll start feeling very, very sick. But there's a way to stop it," Emily said with a smile. "How?" yelped Jared, grabbing at his stomach instinctively. "I have the antidote. I'll give it to you, but first you have to confess your crime on this tape recorder here," said Emily calmly. The young men looked at each other with panic in their eyes. They all nodded their heads in agreement. Soon enough, they all poured their hearts out to Emily, who was carefully recording everything on her tape recorder. Finally, when there was nothing left to say, Emily turned off her recorder and stood up from the table, proud of herself. "What about the antidote? You promised us," Jared asked, on the verge of tears. "Oh, don't worry about it. That wasn't poison I gave you. It was just a laxative. I think it'll do you some good after what you've been through today," Emily replied and hurried towards the exit. Realizing that he had been outsmarted, Jared covered his head with his arms and wept silently. The man was well aware that everything on that tape recorder was enough to put him behind bars for years to come. Jared's hunch turned out to be right, and Emily did exactly what he thought she would do. In addition to notifying the police, the girl also sent their confessions to all the news sites in the country, which made the case all the more famous. Because of this, Jared couldn't even be helped by his father's high-ranking friends. His father even disowned his low-life son, as Jared had disgraced not only himself, but the whole family. Emily was the only person who came out of the situation happy and relieved, for she had restored justice and defended Michael's honor. Bigger news, however, awaited the woman back at the hospital when she came to check on Michael. "I'm very pleased to inform you, Mrs. Dawson, that your fiance is woken up. He's looking forward to seeing you, but he's still very weak and doesn't remember much of his past. Interestingly, though, he said your name as soon as he woke up," said the doctor, smiling. Emily's heart jumped for joy. She felt as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She was able to breathe freely now, and she could finally start a new and happy life with her beloved partner.